A wife ain't family. That's right, he's my dad, ain't he? You're just an outsider, so what's the big deal? I was dumbfounded. Is this what I get after wearing myself to the bone taking care of him? As I wonder what I've been busting my chops for, I feel all the strength drained from my body. There's a feeling of something dropping inside me. It's over, I thought. Something's finally come to an end. Well then, this outsider's gonna head out. As I stood up saying that, something unexpected happened. Me too. Same here. One by one, the relatives stood up and started filing out of the room after me. Leaving my stunned mother-in-law and husband behind, the wake became deserted. Someone gently pushes my back as I hesitate. Startled, I started walking, leaving behind my screaming in-laws. I turned towards the funeral home. Goodbye. And so, I bid farewell to my kind father-in-law. Of course, it's goodbye to my mother-in-law and husband too. The first step of my new life begins now. I'm Nancy, a 48-year-old. I live with my husband and in-laws, working part-time cleaning at a big mall 3 times a week. My husband Frank works for a company. I'm gonna keep working even when I'm 65. They say I can keep coming to the office till I'm 70. Work's my life, you know. Gotta make hay while the sun shines. Frank often brags like this. His catchphrase, "Work is life," is so typical of him. He's the type who loves being out and about, so staying home all the time just doesn't suit him. Frank's the youngest son with 3 older sisters. But they've all married and moved far away, so we only see them at weddings and funerals. My in-laws are elderly now, so they're always at home. We also have a son, Derek, but he lives in the city with his wife and daughter. This is my family. As for my own folks, my brother's family is the main focus now, enjoying a leisurely life in the countryside. These days, we only exchange seasonal greetings. After more than 35 years of marriage, when I think of family, it's the faces of my husband and in-laws I live with that come to mind. Of course, I thought I was a family member to my husband and in-laws too. I never dreamed there'd come a day when that would be turned on its head. It was a hot summer when my father-in-law's health took a turn for the worse. He got sick, had surgery, and was hospitalized. Being bedridden for a while really weakened him. When he finally came home after rehab, he said with such joy, "There's no place like home. I just couldn't settle in at the hospital." But my father-in-law's ordeal wasn't over. In trying to get back in shape, he overdid it and fell, breaking a bone. At 81, it took him quite a while to recover. The broken bones just wouldn't knit, and he could barely stand. As time went on, his body kept shrinking. His muscles wasted away, and he could hardly walk on his own. "We'll take care of Dad at home. Looking after him till the end is how we show our filial piety." The night before my father-in-law was discharged from fracture treatment, Frank solemnly declared this. His mother and I agreed, and our life of caregiving began. But when we welcomed my father-in-law home, the situation was more serious than we thought. Our old house was full of steps and had no handrails. The bathroom was slippery with a deep tub. There was no way he could bathe alone. We'd need to renovate the house to fix the steps and add handrails, but Frank wasn't keen on it. "Ain't it a waste when we don't know how long he's gonna live?" He'd say such things when his father wasn't around. Exasperated, I became a human walking stick, supporting my father-in-law all around the house. His leg muscles had weakened so much that he needed help to stand up and sit down. He even needed assistance to sit on the toilet. I quit my part-time job to keep lending a hand to my father-in-law. But then I started having problems too. Specifically, back pain. "Oh, my back. Hey, can you help your dad to the bathroom for a bit?" But my husband wouldn't help. Instead, he'd click his tongue with a look of disdain and say, "I come home dog-tired from work. You're at home all day taking it easy, so you can handle that much, can't you?" Thinking caregiving is taking it easy, that's beyond lacking understanding. As for my mother-in-law, she pretends not to hear, using her poor hearing as an excuse. She's the one who's really taking it easy, sitting around watching TV all day. Yet she won't even cook meals instead. All the housework remained my job. Left with no choice, I soldiered on alone. We could rely on caregivers, but daily life still depended on family. If things stayed like this, it was only a matter of time before my father-in-law fell again. I don't think I can keep this up much longer. If he falls again, he might end up bedridden for good. That'd be tough on him too, right? If you can't pitch in, wouldn't it be safer to move him to a facility with professionals? I finally worked up the courage to suggest this to my husband. It was the result of a lot of worry and research on my part. But my husband and mother-in-law just laid into me. Don't talk nonsense. You're just saying that because it's a hassle, ain't you? What do you think my parents are? Treating them like they're in the way. No matter how much I tried to explain, they just got angry and wouldn't try to understand. Far from treating him like he was in the way, I was trying to protect my father-in-law's body, but they decided I was the bad guy. My father-in-law, the one being cared for, was the only one who fully understood my burden and consideration. He always looked out for me and never failed to express his gratitude. But when it came to the facility, he furrowed his brow apologetically. I think you're right, Nancy. But you know, I've got this wish to end my days in this house I worked so hard to build. I know it's asking too much. Don't fuss over me, just let me lie around here till I breathe my last. His voice was unusually weak for my usually cheerful father-in-law. His smiling face was so kind. I suddenly realized how my father-in-law felt, remembering his happy smile when he came home from the hospital. His desire to stay in the familiar home hit me hard. I knew I couldn't expect any help from my husband or mother-in-law going forward. Even so, I decided in my heart to look after him till the end. The caregiving went on for years. As I'd expected, my husband and mother-in-law didn't pitch in at all. What's more, my mother-in-law was as demanding as ever. Hey, haven't you been slacking off lately? Make us some proper meals, will you? She says, sitting back all high and mighty. If anything, I'm the one who's run ragged with all this caretaking. You'd think they could cut me some slack for throwing together a quick meal now and then. It's the same when I'm wiping down my father-in-law. She just hollers from in front of the TV without lifting a finger. That ain't the way to wipe him, it hurts. You ain't gonna get him clean like that. Wring out that washcloth properly. Her mouth's the only thing that moves. At first, I tried to take her seriously, but I've learned to tune her out. Heck, if I didn't, I'd never get anything done. As for my husband, he gets all huffy if I so much as mention the caregiving or his mom. It's a daily occurrence for him to heave a big sigh and run off to the john or bedroom. When it's really bad, he'll chuck the newspaper at me and glare, clicking his tongue. Seems he just doesn't want to hear about taking care of his own folks. 5 years into the caregiving, my father-in-law's illness came back and he had to be hospitalized. Even then, my husband and mother-in-law just complained without lifting a finger to help with the preparations and care. In the end, everything was dumped on me. I'd go to the hospital, pick up the laundry, come home and do the housework. After the surgery, my father-in-law was discharged again for home care. On the doctor's advice, we tried to get outside help like home health aides and day services, but my mother-in-law pitched a fit and went around bad-mouthing me to all the relatives. She's the devil of a daughter-in-law. Trying to pawn off grandpa on strangers instead of taking care of him herself. While my mother-in-law was gripping like that, my father-in-law was actually keen on going to day services. Sounds like fun. I'd like to go, he'd say with a smile. But my husband wouldn't budge, citing the financial burden. Even though the social worker from the city and I tried to convince him, he just wouldn't have it. They both knew it was what my father-in-law wanted, but it didn't seem to change their minds. As my father-in-law's face grew sadder and sadder, I was on pins and needles. Then they came out with this doozy. A daughter-in-law's free labor, ain't she? Don't you go complaining just because she ain't the sharpest tool in the shed. My mother-in-law cackled in that vulgar way of hers. To top it off, she smacked my father-in-law's leg so hard it made a sound, shocking the social worker. My husband clapped his hands and laughed, praising his mother's opinion. That's right. This one's got nothing but time on her hands, might as well have her take care of Dad real quick. My father-in-law bit his lip, looking frustrated. He'd been looking forward to it so much, it'd be a shame to end it like this. I decided to use money from my own savings account to contract with the day service. I even asked Derek, who lives separately, for support, and we arranged for him to use the service a few times a month. My father-in-law was over the moon. Seeing his full smile after so long made me happy too. When I said I'd pay, my mother-in-law and husband backed down, but they still looked disgruntled. That's when my father-in-law finally snapped. Shut your traps! If you won't allow even this much, get out of the house I built. When it's all over, I'll come back to haunt you. His voice, rarely raised in anger, had a kind of heartbreaking ring to it. As time went on, my father-in-law's condition worsened, and he needed help even in the middle of the night. I kept up the caregiving till I was worn to the bone. My face looked like it had aged 10 years. I didn't even have time to dye my hair, and some of it fell out from stress, showing my scalp. There were nights when I'd catch my own eye in the mirror and burst into tears. What's gonna become of me? Those were truly tough days. But the end finally came. After 10 years of battling illness with only me to care for him, my father-in-law passed on to heaven. The day he died, I felt like all the air had been let out of me. When his lifeless body came home, I cried so hard I could barely breathe. The wake and funeral were held quietly. My mother-in-law put on a good show of tears. My husband talked to the relatives with a face that screamed, "Look what a good son I am." Still, I kept quiet and focused on the behind-the-scenes work. Then came time for the funeral reception. My husband just sat there like a lump, while my mother-in-law chatted and laughed with the relatives. I was left alone to serve coffee. I was genuinely grateful when the younger relatives offered to help. But when the food was brought out, I realized we were short one chair. As I started to panic, my husband turned to me with a smug look and suddenly burst out laughing. I get it. You thought you were gonna eat too? We didn't order any for you. If you're hungry, go over there and eat this. He pulled out one of the snacks left over. He tried to push it on me and shoo me out of the room where the reception was being prepared. Shocked, I resisted. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see my mother-in-law grinning with glee in the back of the room. My husband had been in charge of arranging everything for the reception. But it seems leaving me out was my mother-in-law's idea. A daughter-in-law ain't family. My mother-in-law said loudly, covering her mouth with her hand. She even waved her hand, shooing me away. I was stunned. Then my husband followed up with his own heartless words. That's right. He was my dad, wasn't he? You're just an outsider, so what's the big deal? I didn't even have the energy to argue anymore. If I'm an outsider, then what does that make these people who pawned off their family's care on an outsider and did nothing themselves? This exchange happened in front of everyone, and the stares from my husband's relatives were intense. I suddenly felt all the strength leave my body. I managed to grab onto a chair to keep from falling, but I was at my limit. Well then, this outsider's gonna head out, I said, grabbing my handbag. The corner of my bag hit my husband, but I didn't even feel like apologizing anymore. That's when something unexpected happened. Me too. Same here. One after another, the relatives stood up and started getting ready to leave. My mother-in-law started screaming in a panic, but no one listened. My father-in-law's siblings, nephews, distant relatives, and even my husband's sisters all got up with disgusted looks on their faces. We can't be part of a funeral like this. We're leaving. Poor Bill must be crying in heaven. He was always saying what a good daughter-in-law you were, thanking you for taking care of him all by yourself. And then to treat his beloved benefactor like this. That's what my father-in-law's cousin said before leaving. As I stood there bewildered, someone gently pushed my back. It was Aunt Peggy, my husband's aunt. She was my father-in-law's sister-in-law and the most level-headed person among the relatives. Startled, I left my screaming mother-in-law and walked out of the room. Just before leaving, I looked at my father-in-law's photo. Goodbye. And so I bid farewell to my kind father-in-law and left the venue. When we got to the parking lot, Aunt Peggy told me that my mother-in-law had been bad-mouthing my caregiving under the guise of complaining. She'd been mocking how I'd worked myself to the bone, and thought it was only natural that she and Frank didn't lift a finger to help. No matter how you slice it, you're the one who's off her rocker. I told her it's her husband's care, so she ought to do it herself. I kept telling her to treat you right, Nancy, but it seems she still doesn't get it. Aunt Peggy had experience caring for her own parents and in-laws. That's probably why she understood my feelings better than anyone. Just then, the door flew open with a clatter of footsteps, and my mother-in-law and Frank came rushing out. They both looked flustered. When they saw me, they came charging over, faces red with anger. "They've come after me," I said, shrinking back. At the same time, Aunt Peggy started laying into them. "What do you two think you're doing to the person who's been taking care of everything? Not family? You've lived together all this time, depended on her for everything, and you've got the nerve to say that? Have you no shame?" For the first time, I felt strongly that someone truly understood my struggles. Tears started falling unbidden. My mother-in-law and Frank stood there, eyes wide, suddenly quiet. They'd opened their mouths as if to yell at me, but then swallowed their words and fell silent. The relatives who'd been about to leave gathered around and started laying into the two of them. Some said they'd heard from my father-in-law about my devoted care when they'd visited him in the hospital. Even those who didn't know the whole story were sympathetic to me, saying, just from that scene alone, it's clear which side is out of line. I was just so glad to be understood. In the tense atmosphere, Derek came running over and grabbed my arm. "Mom, come back with us. You can stay at our place. Who knows what they might do if you go back to that house with Grandma and Dad." Derek's wife and even little Tiffany nodded in agreement, looking dead serious. Seems Frank and his mother must have looked pretty crazy to my son's family. I quietly agreed and set off with Derek and his family. The stress from caregiving had left me a bit mentally fragile, so I'd brought all my valuables like my bank book and insurance card, worried about leaving the house empty. Frank had cruelly mocked me for this too, but now it turned out to be a stroke of luck. There was no reason to go back to that house where I had no family left. I decided to go with Derek and his family to their home in the city far away. I had no change of clothes or anything, but they said we could buy what I needed when we got there. "It's like we're making a great escape," I said with a half smile, but I knew better than anyone that it wasn't just like one, it really was. If I'd stayed at Frank's house, I'm sure they would have kept exploiting me without treating me like family. The signs were probably there from way back, but I'd overlooked them, caught up in the busyness of raising kids and caregiving. Now it has finally come out in the open. I guess I was never really family to them all along. I had no idea things had gotten so bad. I was shocked to see how worn out you looked, Mom. I thought Grandpa's care must have been really tough, but I should have come sooner. I'm sorry. Derek's apology made my heart ache. I felt bad for him, having to see such an awful scene at an already sad occasion like a funeral. It must have looked to Derek like a family hurting family. I didn't want to worry you, so I kept quiet. I should have asked for help sooner. I'm sorry for making you see something so unpleasant. Derek lives so far away he has to fly to visit, so he only came back about once a year to begin with. And after the caregiving started, that infectious disease was going around the world, so out of concern for my father-in-law's weakened immune system, he hadn't been able to visit for years. We'd talk on the phone sometimes, but I hadn't told him how much trouble I was in, not wanting to burden Derek's family living so far away. At Derek's family's urging, I decided to stay in a room at their house for a while and take it easy. As soon as we got to Derek's house, he got into a big argument with Frank on the phone. "How could you say Mom's not family? She worked the hardest taking care of Grandpa, and she's been working for the family all this time. I cringed at Frank's angry voice coming through the phone, watching anxiously. When I asked Derek about it later, he said Frank had fired back. It was my father's funeral, wasn't it? You and the relatives have lost your minds. It's only natural that someone without blood ties isn't treated like family. Nancy's the craziest of all. She doesn't know her place. Acting like she's one of us. You'd be better off not getting involved with a woman who doesn't know her station. What nonsense. After being called out by so many people, you'd think they'd realize they were the ones in the wrong. And since when is a wife not family? What era are they living in? Well, I guess that level of behavior would be going too far in any era. Derek's response was, "No way. Of course I'm gonna be involved. Dad, you're always together with Grandma, aren't you? It's the same thing. Mom is my real mother. Of course she's an important family to me." Frank was apparently at a loss for words for the first time. Maybe he'd been thinking only of his own son and forgot that Derek was my son too. He couldn't possibly think he'd had a child all on his own, could he? It's baffling. Forget it. I had no idea my own parents were this unreasonable. I can't believe this. And if you're gonna talk about blood ties, Grandma isn't related by blood to Grandpa either, you know. That's how married couples are, right? I don't think blood is the only condition for being family. I'm done. Derek raised his voice and hung up the phone forcefully. I was worried I'd cause a fight between father and son, but thinking about it, Derek's right not to approve of a father who acts like that. If there's a cause for the fight, it's surely Frank, not Derek. Then Derek turned to me and said, "Let's live together here." I'm touched by the sentiment. I can tell it comes from a place of concern and care. But even as I appreciated it, I shook my head. I don't want to be a burden on your family. I'd rather spend some time on my own. I'd decided to live alone for a while. Right after this, I fell ill for a couple of days. While I was recovering, Derek rushed to find me a place to stay. Once I got better, I went to look too, and we decided to start with a furnished condo. The plan was to stay there for a while to recover physically and mentally, then look for a more permanent place later. The condo came with furniture and appliances, so I could move in right away. I left my valuables and phone with Derek. I'm gonna spend some time in a space where no one can bother me. Apparently, Frank and his mother were still calling and complaining non-stop. But since I'd left my phone with Derek, none of that noise reached me. "Leave it all to me," Derek said reassuringly. Thanks to that, I can use my time just for myself. Quiet, free time passes by. The fatigue in my mind and body won't disappear easily, but I felt relieved to finally have some peace. When I got into bed, tears started flowing naturally. "It's finally over," I whispered, and a gentle, bright image of my father-in-law's smiling face floated into my mind. I felt like he was encouraging me too, which made me a little happy. Another day, another phone call. It's become a regular thing, Frank calling to tell me to come back. But I keep ignoring him because his reasons for summoning me are all selfish, like, who's gonna cook? The dust's piling up, and the trash is overflowing. The laundry's piling up too, don't you think that's sloppy? If it bothers them so much, they could do the chores themselves, but they're trying to dump it all on me. Tonight, my son, who picked up the phone again, tilted his head and covered the mouthpiece. I watched him, wondering if he had something to say to me, when he said, "Dad's saying he'll divorce you if you don't come back. What do you want to do, Mom?" "Do it!" I answered without missing a beat, overjoyed. It was a totally knee-jerk reaction. Felt like my mouth answered before my brain could think. Derek burst out laughing. Holding his stomach and giggling, he said in a low voice, "It's been a while since I've heard you sound so cheerful, Mom." When he stopped laughing, Derek relayed my feelings to Frank over the phone. Then a high-pitched voice that clearly wasn't Frank started yelling something on the other end. Probably my mother-in-law. Is that your grandma? What's she saying? I asked, but Derek just made a terrible face and shook his head. His bitter expression clearly showed he had no fondness for the person on the other end. On the weekend, Derek flew over to Frank with the filled-out divorce papers. He's been taking care of everything for me. I can't thank him enough. It really makes me feel like having and raising him was worth it, looking back on memories from when Derek was little. While waiting for him to come back, I spent some quality time with my cute granddaughter Tiffany. As Tiffany taught me some trendy new dance, I thought about how my mother-in-law must feel about her grandson. If my grandkid treated me like that, I'd be too heartbroken to go on. My mother-in-law's gonna be pretty lonely from now on. I had a chilling premonition about her twilight years, now that Derek and the relatives have turned against her. The next day, Derek came home with the divorce papers, now signed by Frank too. You can submit it on Monday. He's finally gonna be my ex-husband, not my husband. Thinking about that, I felt somehow lighter. I didn't feel a shred of lingering attachment. He was supposed to be someone I once loved, but I couldn't conjure up a single good memory. Seems like before I knew it, I was only in that house to take care of my father-in-law. I can't tell if I married Frank or if I married caregiving. I said with a shrug, thinking that this was the end of my role as a caregiver too. Afterwards, something unbelievable came to light. My father-in-law had left a will. And its contents were unexpected for everyone. I leave everything to Nancy, who took care of me all by herself. That's what was written in the will, they said. I got to see it later too, and though the handwriting was a bit shaky, it was unmistakably my father-in-law's. He must have written it. His handwriting was beautiful. My wife and my son Frank were all talk and no action. I'm truly grateful to Nancy for letting me go to day services, which was my last joy, using her own savings. Thank you. Once you're done taking care of me, please live as you like. I hope you'll be happy. My father-in-law had even recorded a video message in the presence of a lawyer, declaring this. What's more, it turns out he'd already secretly transferred most of his savings to an account in my name while he was still alive. He'd done this right when I'd started caregiving in earnest. Apparently, he'd done it with the help of the staff when I'd asked him to go out. Even though it had happened over 5 years ago, I hadn't noticed a thing. So before the inheritance, all that was left was the house and land, and a few $100 set aside for hospital and funeral expenses. He'd said to leave even that to me. Of course, I immediately got a flood of angry calls from my ex-husband. My mother-in-law was apparently in a panic. It's no wonder, since the house and land they're currently living on now belongs to me, their divorced ex-daughter-in-law. How could this happen? Give back my dad's money right now. Put the house and land in my name. My ex-husband tried to threaten me, yelling, but I was still exhausted. There's no way a few months could heal 10 years of caregiver fatigue. I didn't even feel like dealing with him, so I coldly shot back. What's it to you, stranger? Shut up. Then I slammed down the phone. I quickly responded to the call from the lawyer and decided to recognize their legally required portion of the inheritance. After constructive discussions through our respective lawyers, we found that giving them the house and land would exceed their legal share by quite a bit. The old house itself wasn't worth much, but the land was somewhat valuable. They reluctantly decided to give me money and take the house and land. As a result, their savings took a hit and their finances are in dire straits. My mother-in-law, who'd been a housewife into her late 80s, is now completely dependent on my ex-husband, fearing she'll end up on the streets otherwise. For the first time, my ex-husband found himself in the position of caring for his mother, who'd turned into a selfish old woman. Seems it didn't take long for him to reach his limit. There was no way he could balance it with work, so my ex-husband was forced to choose between continuing his job or giving up on caring for his mother. Apparently, he tried asking relatives for help, but they all turned him down, scolding him about how the daughter-in-law had struggled back then and so on. I finally understand your hardship. Come back, please help me, he called, crying, but it was way too late. Or rather, it didn't sound like he truly understood, just that he didn't want to struggle himself. Still mentally exhausted, I coldly told him, "Don't call me again, stranger. If you have anything to say, talk to my lawyer." I unplugged the phone, and while I was at it, asked my son to change my number. After that, I had some quiet days for a while. About 6 years later, I got word that my mother-in-law had collapsed and become bedridden. I'm a stranger now, but Derek is still her grandson, so it's natural for him to be notified. Apparently, my mother-in-law had developed dementia before collapsing, and the house was a mess. What's more, my ex-husband, who couldn't cook, had been feeding her fast food every day. It's hard to imagine that was good for her health, and I can't help but think it might have contributed to her collapse. I might do something drastic because of the stress of caregiving. Please help me. My ex-husband begged Derek. Derek reluctantly went to check on the situation, and that's how I heard about it. I told him I'd help find a nursing home and showed him some brochures. I also got him connected with some government services, so I think they'll be okay. Derek said, coming back quickly with a cool expression. My ex-husband ended up putting his mother in a facility because the caregiving was too much, but apparently, the relatives keep saying you didn't let your wife do this every time they see him, and he's aging rapidly from the stress. Time marched on, and 2.5 years passed. The other day, my mother-in-law finally passed away. Derek and his wife reluctantly went to the funeral, but Tiffany and I stayed home. Apparently, my ex-husband was looking forward to seeing Tiffany and was disappointed. But Tiffany, who's become close to me and is like a friend now, refused to go of her own accord. She probably won't be meeting my ex-husband with a friendly attitude anytime soon. Dad looked about 80 years old. The house was like a hoarder's nest. I guess I ought to help clean up a bit at least. Derek said this, but smiled to show he had no intention of making me lift a finger. I think that's fine too. After all, I'm a stranger to both my ex-husband and my late mother-in-law now. 10 years have passed since my father-in-law passed away. At first, I planned to live alone freely in a place far from Derek's family, but Derek, worried about me, rented a place close to his home. It wasn't just my own family. The relatives on my ex-husband's side, who I'd gotten closer to after the funeral, all urged me to accept my son's kindness. I was so touched I could cry, feeling that everyone truly cared about me. I think my mind and body have finally recovered recently. The hair that had fallen out has grown back, and I recently got it dyed at a salon for the first time in ages. It's not jet black, but a stylish color with some highlights to soften my pale complexion. You look younger. Everyone, from Derek to my friends, says that to me. I'm spending happy days that make that day of despair feel like a lie. I'd quit my long-time part-time job when my father-in-law's care became demanding. But after things settled down, I missed having work to do each day. So I looked for a job in the city I'd moved to and ended up starting as a fast food staff member. Welcome. Greeting customers with a bright smile, my days are fulfilling as I interact with lots of people. The pay isn't much, but with Derek's support, I'm getting by just fine. Thanks to that, I can even use part of my wages as pocket money. Grandma, this flannel is so cute. Hey, wanna get matching ones? Tiffany, who comes to play every weekend and invites me out, is adorable too. The other day, I bought a lovely vase. I arranged some flowers in it as an offering to my father-in-law. The vibrant colors seemed to brighten up the whole house. As I put my hands together for my father-in-law who's traveled far away. I'm having happy days now.